Laurel Bennett's heart pounded beneath frozen breath as darkness swallowed the ridge. Clutching a blood-stained pine branch, she huddled against a glacier wall, every shiver a reminder that one wrong move could send her tumbling into oblivion. Back at camp, her absence went unnoticed. Up here, the wind howled like a hunting pack. Injured, alone, and running out of hope. The 16-year-old sketched a desperate survival plan in her mind, though she'd never learned how to survive at all. Laurel Bennett sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, broadcast-quality headphones cocooning her ears. In the dim glow of her desk lamp, her sketchbook lay open, a half-finished drawing of an abandoned farmhouse taking shape under her graphite pencil. True crime podcast chatter, detail by gruesome detail, whispered through her headphones, weaving tales of long, cold cases and sleight-of-hand clues that she devoured like candy. Outside, June sunlight slanted through lace curtains, but Laurel barely noticed. Her world was lines on paper and mysteries in her ears. She paused, fingertips smudging the barn's weathered siding, and glanced at the framed photo on her desk. Her and Mom at the county fair, both grinning, shoulders brushing. Laurel's smile flickered. She loved this cocoon of quiet introspection. The outdoors, with its unpredictability and wind-whipped dangers, felt almost alien. Yet tomorrow morning she would board a bus bound for the Rocky Mountains, an idea born in her parents' hearts, sold to her as a chance to grow, an adventure you'll never forget, and an opportunity to bond with your church friends. A thrill-averse part of her shuddered at the thought. Her phone buzzed. A group text from the youth group leader. "Packing list reminder. Hiking boots, layers, water bottles. See you bright and early, Lauren." She sighed and typed back, "On it." Beneath the light-hearted message lurked her own whispered worry. What if I'm the one who can't keep up? Downstairs, the clink of dishes hinted that dinner was underway. Laurel carefully slid her pencil into her sketchbook's coil and tucked the work into her backpack. Today's artistic sanctuary would become a storage pouch for flannel shirts and trail rations. She zipped the pack slowly, feeling its unfamiliar weight, and stood. In the kitchen, her mother ladled tomato basil soup into 2 bowls. Steam curled upward, fragrant and homey. She offered 1 bowl and a questioning look. Laurel managed a smile. "Thanks, Mom. I finished packing." The lie spoke volumes of her unease. Mom set the bowl before her and studied Laurel's face. "Excited?" she asked, voice gentle. Laurel scooped a spoonful, held it mid-air, and shook her head. "A little nervous." She swallowed. "I've never hiked more than our backyard hill." Mom sat, her expression a mix of understanding and quiet firmness. "I know it's outside your comfort zone, honey, but sometimes we find new parts of ourselves when we step into the unknown." That phrase sent a ripple through Laurel's mind. New parts of ourselves. She remembered a flash of her father's laugh on a family camping trip when she was 8, light breaking through pines, hot cocoa by the fire. He'd shown her how to string marshmallows on a stick just right. The memory felt distant, like a line she'd sketched once and then erased. She sipped her soup and nodded at her mother. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll try." The words tasted strange, as if borrowed, but beneath the unease stirred something else. A faint spark that maybe, just maybe, she could learn to trust her own footsteps as well as her pencil strokes. Tomorrow she would follow a trail through that wild, indifferent wilderness. Tonight she would sleep under the steady hum of her anxiety and hope it wouldn't drown out her resolve. Dawn's pale light slid beneath Laurel Bennett's bedroom door. She lay motionless for a long moment, listening to her own breath, steady but insistent, as if the rhythm could soothe the tremor in her stomach. Today was departure day. She rose and crossed to her desk, where the flannel shirt from her backpack lay folded beside her sketchbook. For a heartbeat, she traced the soft plaid with her fingertips, the memory of graphite and paper tugging at her comfort zone. Then she shook her head, tucked the shirt back, and closed the sketchbook. There would be time for drawing again, sometime far from here, she hoped. In the kitchen, her father paced while pouring coffee. He glanced up at Laurel, offering a small smile. "Did you sleep okay?" he asked, his voice low. She seated herself at the table, pulling on thick wool socks. Their muted pattern reminded her of pine needles scattered across the forest floor, a place she'd soon traverse, willingly or not. "Mostly," she answered. "I'm just excited to get it over with." Her father nodded, refilling her mug. "Try to see it as an adventure. You might surprise yourself." His eyes carried the same gentle conviction her mother had shown the night before. Laurel exhaled, sipping the bitter warmth. She loved her parents with every cautious beat of her heart, and yet she felt the weight of their hope as acutely as the straps of her backpack on her shoulders. Outside, the morning air was crisp. Laurel slung the pack over her back, its contents carefully balanced between warmth and necessity. Thermal layers, water bottles, a first aid kit she barely knew how to use. She hesitated before her front door, inhaling the scent of pine from the nearby woods. This threshold separated the world she understood from the one she was about to enter. Her neighbor and classmate, Danny, called from the driveway. Danny's bright yellow hiking boots gleamed under a collection of patches she'd sewn on, trail names, souvenir pins, a small compass charm. "Ready?" she asked, voice upbeat and wholly unburdened. She always seemed born for this. Sun-baked trails, endless horizon, the promise of a fortress of trees. Laurel forced a smile and nodded. "As I'll ever be." They climbed into the minivan, where the rest of the church youth group buzzed with chatter. Phones out, they snapped selfies, comparing gear and boots. Laurel buckled in next to Danny, who chattered about trail snacks and campfire songs. Laurel's mind drifted to the podcast she'd paused, voices describing survival tactics, water purification, shelter building. Each tip felt both alien and urgently necessary. She glanced out the window as the van rolled onto the highway, the suburbs giving way to rolling fields, and then the foothills of the Rockies rising like ancient sentinels. A sudden jolt startled her when the van hit a pothole. Danny laughed and nudged her. "Don't look so serious. You'll love it once we're all out there." Laurel nodded again, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her pack. Beneath the excitement of her peers, a stubborn knot of fear remained. She reminded herself of her parents' faith in her, of the flash of her father's laughter by the campfire long ago, and of the spark she'd felt in her chest when she promised to try. As the mountains drew nearer, their peaks etched against a pale sky, Laurel closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "One step at a time." And with that, she braced for the unknown. By mid-morning on the second day, the trail widened and rose to a rocky outcrop that promised panoramic views of jagged peaks and mist-filled valleys. The youth group paused at the lookout ridge, unpacking water bottles and adjusting day packs as the wind tugged at their sleeves. A haze of pine and damp earth draped the scene in quiet grandeur. Laurel Bennett inhaled deeply, her pulse slowing as she drank in the mountain air, so different from the stale confines of her sketching nook back home. Ahead, the group gathered atop a flat boulder, posing for photos against an endless horizon. Laughter and joking voices intertwined. Someone recited an excerpt from Charles Dickens, another teased about who'd finish their granola first. Laurel stood back, sketchbook in hand, her eyes tracing the ridgeline's serrated teeth. She felt simultaneously small and electrified, as if the mountains were whispering secrets she might capture in graphite. A sudden flash of russet darted behind a clump of alpine grass. Laurel froze. A fox, its coat the color of autumn leaves, shyly peered at her from a cluster of stones. Instinct jolted through her. This was the subject she had been waiting for. Quietly, she slipped her sketchbook from her backpack and knelt, her pencil tapping a gentle rhythm against the paper. "When you draw something," she murmured to herself, "you really see it." The words felt intimate, a confession borrowed from her art. She remembered the farmhouse sketch she'd finished last week, the way light struck a broken window, the crooked hinge. If she focused, she could almost feel the fox's velvet ears and the brush of its tail. Laurel rose and crept forward, careful not to crinkle her water bottle or rustle the leaves. The fox took a cautious step back, then stayed, as if granting her permission. Heart hammering, she flipped to a fresh page and began to capture its delicate muzzle and wary stance. Minutes ticked by without warning. Behind her, the group's chatter faded. The photo session ended. Footsteps crunched on rock. When Laurel looked up, the boulder was empty. No Danny waving to her. No youth leader calling her name. The vanishing felt sudden, like the fox disappearing behind a boulder. She stood and called out, voice carried off by the wind, "Hey!" No response. A knot tightened in her chest, her pulse quickened as she clutched the sketchbook to her chest. She pivoted, searching for the trail's familiar ribbon of dirt snaking down the slope. Instead, she saw only rocky scree and distant ridges that blurred into the sky. She retraced her steps toward the fox's last refuge, hoping to find a landmark. Each boulder looked the same, each tuft of grass an indistinguishable echo. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Her stomach clenched around half a granola bar, her water bottle still half full but heavy in her hand. The sun shifted, and shadows stretched like skeletal fingers across the ridge. Panic, she had promised herself, would come later. She took a slow breath, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Just find the path, she told herself, tracing a mental line back toward the boulder. Yet as she turned, a sliver of memory flickered, her father's firm voice reminding her of compass directions on that long-ago camping trip. But this time she had no compass, only this sketchbook and the echo of her own unanswered question. Had she followed the fox or her curiosity straight into the wilderness's waiting arms? Shadows lengthened across the ridge as the sun dipped behind the distant peaks, igniting the sky in bruised purples and blood-red streaks. Laurel Bennett's breath puffed in ragged clouds as she stumbled through the thinning air, her every footstep tentative on the jagged stones. Each echo of loose gravel beneath her boots made her heart thud. The trail, if it had ever existed here, was swallowed by the fading light, and with it any sense of direction. Panic tightened around her ribs like an iron band, but she forced herself to keep walking, one cautious step after another. When the first chill of dusk brushed her cheek, she stopped and scanned the horizon for landmarks, nothing but silhouettes of craggy spires and the skeletal outlines of pines. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. The rasp of wind carried a warning. In these mountains, night fell fast, and darkness brought predators. Wolves, bears, mountain lions all prowled under the cover of stars. Her shoulders tensed. She reached for her water bottle as if it were a lifeline. A sudden gust rattled a line of pine needles overhead. Laurel ducked beneath a fallen log, its broad trunk offering scant shelter from the biting wind. She lowered herself onto the forest floor, stripped needles from nearby boughs, and began to weave them into a makeshift nest. Fingers trembling, she wove a small pocket of insulation, pressing down on the fir twigs until they formed a soft cushion. It offered no certainty of safety, only a fragile barrier between her body and the frozen earth. She curled into the nest, hugging her knees to her chest. The wind howled through the ridge, a mournful chorus that could have been wolves singing in the distance. Alone under the vast indigo sky, Laurel's mind conjured memories of her childhood bedroom, the soft glow of a nightlight, her mother's voice reading a bedtime story, the comfort of fresh sheets tucked around her. She pictured the lines of her favorite tale of a brave knight who braved dark forests to find his way home. The echo was bittersweet, a reminder that this night held no promise of rescue. Her teeth chattered. She drew her coat tighter, pressing her cheek against the pine needle cushion. In the valley below, she imagined the campsite, the flicker of lantern light, the murmur of her group's dinner prayers, the worried glance of her youth leader as he finally noticed the empty spaces in his head count. Guilt gnawed at her. She had wandered off to sketch a fox, chasing an idea rather than staying on the path. Now she was that missing count, that name shouted into the void. She forced herself to breathe slowly, picturing the outline of that fox's delicate face, its cautious curiosity as it regarded her. Drawing it had felt so natural. Maybe, she thought, if she could find that same focus again, summoning the artist's steadiness, she could map her surroundings, retrace her steps before the night swallowed them entirely. Above her, the first pinpricks of starlight shimmered. Laurel closed her eyes, each breath a silent vow. Tomorrow she would rise with the dawn, scan for tracks in the frost, and follow them back to life. But for now, she pressed her hand against her heart, willing its rapid drumming to slow, and drifted into a sleep stirred by wind and worry, a fragile refuge beneath the generous cloak of night. Dawn broke in a brittle whisper, pale light filtering through the evergreens to scatter glittering beads across the ridge. Laurel Bennett uncurled from her pine needle nest, each movement sending tremors of cold through her limbs. She pressed her palm to the frozen earth and rose, scanning the snow-flecked stones for any sign of direction. The forest floor was a mosaic of white and shadow, the trail she might have followed utterly hidden beneath last night's frost. She stepped forward, balancing on one boot, then the other, mind focused on finding lower ground where rescue tracks might appear. A hollow wind moaned through the pines. Laurel's jaw ached from clenching. Her throat felt raw as she swallowed every anxious thought. A sudden glint caught her eye, a smooth sheet of ice spanning a crevice between two boulders. She paused, heart pounding, and in that moment of hesitation, the world gave way. Her boot slid. Time slowed as Laurel's arms flailed. The ice shattered beneath her weight, sending her plunging 20 feet into a hidden ravine below. The impact stole her breath in a single, gut-searing crash. She landed on a tangle of rocks and snow, her body folding like a broken twig. Ice shards bit into her cheek. Pain exploded through her right shoulder and radiated down her arm. She tried to scream, but only a strangled gasp emerged. Laurel lay on her side, vision blurred by drifting snowflakes and tears. She pressed a trembling hand to her shoulder, bones misaligned beneath her skin, each breath sending lightning through her chest. A rivulet of crimson oozed from a gash along her thigh, warm against the frozen ground. Panic flickered at the edges of her mind, but she forced it down, closing her eyes against the swirling vertigo. A gentle voice echoed in her memory, soft and soothing. Opening her eyes, Laurel saw her mother kneeling beside her on a plush quilt, reading from a picture book in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. "Once upon a time," the voice whispered, "a brave girl faced a dark forest and found her way home by the light in her heart." She reached for her mother's hand, expecting the warmth of skin, but only cold air greeted her. The hallucination dissolved, and Laurel was back on jagged stones, alone with the wind's mournful cry. She forced herself up onto an elbow, the stinging pain from her shoulder threatening to knock her back down. Each breath came in ragged bursts. She surveyed the ravine's steep walls, too sheer to climb, too deep to ignore. The forest above seemed impossibly distant, as though the world she had known was sealed behind an invisible barrier. Blood trickled down her leg, mixing with melting snow. Fear threatened to break her resolve, but she pressed her teeth together and pressed on. Carefully, she scooped a palmful of snow, letting it melt between her teeth to numb the pain. The cold bit at her wounds, but she welcomed the distraction. She had to move, to find a way out of this chasm before darkness returned. Memories of that childhood camping trip flickered across her mind. Her father guiding her down a gentle hillside, one steady hand beneath her elbow. She imagined his voice urging, "Trust your footing, Laurel, one step at a time." She closed her bleeding hand around an icy root protruding from the earth wall and yanked herself upright despite the agony. With a muted sob, she hauled her weight upward, sliding on snow and grit, inch by excruciating inch. Reaching a small ledge, Laurel collapsed, shoulder throbbing and thigh burning. Tears mingled with sweat on her brow, but beneath the pain, a flicker of stubborn determination glowed. She had survived the fall. Now she would survive the climb. One breath, one movement, one heartbeat closer to dawn. By midday on the third day, the ravine's bitter air had settled into Laurel Bennett's bones. Her dislocated shoulder throbbed with every shallow breath, and her thigh wound pulsed with warmth that belied the freezing world around her. Above, the ridge lay silent beneath a canopy of gray clouds. Below, an unbroken expanse of rock and snow stretched toward an uncertain horizon. Laurel tested her shoulder with a tentative twist. Sharp pain flared, so she eased herself onto all fours and began to crawl, each movement a study in endurance. Her fingers clawed at the snow-packed ground, boots kicking out behind her in jerky motions. She tasted metal when she bit back a groan, but she pressed on inch by inch, driven by a single thought: find the trail. Hours passed in a blur of white and stone. The wind drifted through the crevices like a mournful sigh, carrying distant echoes that might have been wolves, or the ghosts of her own fears. Her ears rang with each breath, and the line between reality and imagination thinned beneath the unrelenting sky. Laurel paused on a flattened ledge and pressed her forehead against a boulder. Beneath a layer of moss and lichen, she found a trickle of runoff where melting snow dripped like tears. She scooped the frigid water into her cupped hands and drank until her chest heaved. The cold stung her throat, but it cleared the haze of exhaustion. She glanced down at the leather strap wrapped around her wrist, a friendship bracelet from middle school now chewed and frayed. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a relentless drumbeat. She tore a thin strip of bark from a nearby pine, gnawed at its fibrous texture, and swallowed, willing it to fill the emptiness. Each small victory offered a pulse of hope. She groaned as she resumed her crawl, moving toward a distant outcrop that might mark the path back to the ridge. A sudden snap of ice behind her jolted her upright, more exertion than she could afford. She blinked into the wind-whipped air. Nothing moved except the swirl of flurries around her. Her heartbeat thundered, and she realized she could not distinguish natural sounds from the growl of predators. Stillness became poisonous. Motion was her only defense. She mapped her own progress by a series of markers: a jagged stone stained with rust-colored lichen, a twisted pine whose roots clung to the mountainside like desperate hands. Where she could, she traced lines in the snow with her fingers, marking her way in the only language she knew. When her shoulder convulsed in protest, she slid on her injured side, using her good arm to pull herself forward, grit in her teeth. Night threatened once more, the sky darkening to bruised purple. Laurel spotted a shallow cave hollowed by wind and perched on a ledge that offered minimal shelter. She dragged herself inside, pressing her back against cool stone. The howl of the wind outside felt closer now, a chorus of hidden mouths searching for warmth. Laurel's eyelids fluttered with exhaustion. She wrapped her arms around her body, clutching the strands of her hair like a lifeline, and closed her eyes. She pictured her mother's gentle voice, her father's steady hand, the fox's curious gaze at the lookout ridge. In the void of darkness, these memories became lanterns. Her body trembled, but her spirit held fast. She whispered a vow beneath her breath. She would not become a footnote in someone else's true crime story. She would survive. And with that fragile promise burning in her chest, Laurel drifted into a sleep haunted by wind and determination. Another night conquered in her crawl toward salvation. Laurel Bennett pressed her back against the cave's cold stone as dawn's pale fingers pried open the sky. Outside, the wind threw snowflakes like shattered glass against the rock face, but inside, a different storm raged, one of memory and longing. She hugged her knees, imagining the warmth of her childhood campsite, where fate felt simpler and fear lived only in bedtime stories. She remembered a summer trip with her father when she was 8. The two of them had pitched a bright green tent beneath towering pines, its rainfly shimmering in the morning sun. He taught her to roast marshmallows just so, his patient smile reflected in the curling sugar. "Keep it turning, Laurel," he'd said, "or it becomes a blazing ball before you can say campfire." She'd giggled as the sticky fluff melted on her tongue. At night they lay side by side on a sleeping bag, counting constellations. He pointed out the Big Dipper and traced Orion's belt, weaving stories of ancient hunters across the velvet sky. In her mind's eye, she heard his steady voice. "When you're lost, remember the stars. They're the world's compass." Back then, the forest had been an ink-blot puzzle waiting for their laughter. Now, it was a labyrinth with jaws wide open. The memory glowed like embers in her chest, a spark against the drifting white. She pressed her palm to her heart, willing the warmth to flood every shivering cell. A sudden crease of pain radiated from her shoulder, pulling her back to the present. She exhaled and tucked the memory away like a talisman. Outside, the sky brightened, revealing a narrow ledge etched into the mountainside. She knew that beyond stood the ridge where she had first chased the fox, where rescue teams might still search. But to reach it, she would face terrain that whispered of avalanches and ice fields. Laurel rose on trembling legs, each movement a conversation with pain. She looked once more at the cave's shadowed mouth, the cold breath of night receding before the day's promise. Drawing in a ragged breath, she traced the hem of her jacket with numb fingers. Hers, the same that held her father's on that starlit night. The silent vow she made then, "Trust your footing," sent a determined pulse through her veins. She stepped onto the ledge, the world unfolding below in glittering scales of ice and stone. Each careful placement of her foot pressed her closer to the sky and further from the memory of safety. Yet with every shudder of fear, she summoned her father's voice and the echo of marshmallow sweet laughter, using them to steady her limbs. As Laurel climbed, the forest's oppressive hush lifted, replaced by the patter of her own heartbeat. Memory and reality converged with each laborious step. A little girl beneath the stars, a teenage survivor clawing toward rescue. And between them, a fragile bridge of hope, built one echo at a time. By the 6th day, the mountains had grown both stranger and more familiar to Laurel Bennett. Familiar in their unrelenting indifference, stranger in the way each ridge and ravine seemed to shift beneath a new veil of snow. Midday light softened to steely gray as heavy clouds gathered overhead, their underbellies roiling like the breath of some ancient beast. Laurel paused on a narrow ledge, shoulder ice cold against her cheek, and watched the first flakes tumble downward, silent and opulent against the dark sky. At first, the snow was a gentle drift, nearly poetic, the way it landed so softly on her lashes, the hush that fell over the world as footprints filled and faded in the white rush. But within hours, the drift had become a gale. Wind tore across the ridge, whipping powder into stinging curtains that blurred the boundary between earth and sky. Laurel pressed herself into the lee of a massive sérac, the glacier's frozen wall, her only shield against the tempest's fury. She pressed her back against the ice, trying to wedge her jacket tighter around her shivering frame. Each breath crystallized in the air, a fleeting shard of her own desperation. The storm buried any trace of her frantic tracks. The shallow grooves in the snow, the smear of blood on the ice, all erased as though she'd never existed. Panic pitched in her chest, but she forced herself to remember the small victories of the past days, drinking meltwater, climbing the ravine wall, marking her path. Each triumph had come from sheer will. Wind howled through crevasses, a keening choir that rattled the very bones of the mountain. Laurel bent her knees, lowering herself, until her arms formed a shield around her knees, her chin tucked to her chest. She drew the tattered remains of her friendship bracelet from her coat pocket and pressed it against her lips, whispering her father's words under her breath. "Trust your footing." The words felt brittle, but they grounded her in a world now spinning with snow. Her survival instincts took over. She searched the ice wall for any fissure deep enough to offer refuge, finding a narrow crevice carved by centuries of meltwater. Laurel forced herself upright and edged into the gap, pressing her body against the ice's unyielding surface. The crevice's hollow welcomed her like a womb of cold stone. Digging with numb fingers, she scraped away fresh snow until the opening felt just wide enough to crawl inside. Inside the crevice, icy air trapped her warmth. She curled into a fetal position, her arms wrapped around her legs and folded in until her body fit the stone cradle. Heat pooled around her core, but her fingers and toes were already fading to numb gray. Hypothermia lurked, a predator prowling the edges of her awareness. Laurel clenched her teeth against the pins and needles that pierced her limbs. She closed her eyes and summoned the memory of home, her mother's gentle hum as she sewed, her father's laughter echoing against tent walls, the soft feel of cotton sheets. Hope, she realized, was as vital as warmth. She pressed a palm to her chest and felt the stubborn pulse beneath her ribs. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice lost in the wind's roar. She rocked herself in the hollow, each motion small but deliberate, staving off the darkness that threatened to claim her. Outside, the storm raged on, burying all evidence of her struggle. Inside, Laurel Bennett clung to memory and breath, two fragile lifelines in a frozen world determined to swallow her whole. A thin veil of dawn light seeped into the glacier crevice, but Laurel Bennett did not rise. Fever burned beneath her skin, each shallow breath a battle against the encroaching cold. In that fragile border between consciousness and oblivion, reality began to twist. She heard her name whispered, soft, urgent, by the crackling voice of a true crime podcast host, as if through a crackling radio. "Laurel, you're tougher than you think," the phantom voice urged. It recalled every tip she had ever paused to hear. Find shelter, conserve energy, signal for help. But here, in the heart of the glacier, those rules felt both brilliant and unreachable. She drifted into a dreamscape stitched from memory and despair. Her mother tucked her beneath a patchwork quilt on a stormy night, reading "Goodnight Moon" in a gentle murmur. "Good night, moon, good night, stars," the lullaby weaving safety around her. Laurel's hallucinated self curled on the quilt, oblivious to frostbite and bone-cold winds, the lines of the story dissolving into the roar of an Arctic gale. A sudden shift, and she was on the ridgeline once more, standing before the fox whose russet coat glowed like embers. It tilted its head, eyes warm and intelligent, as if judging her resolve. She reached out, and its fur felt impossibly soft. Then it dissolved into a swirl of wind-blown ice, leaving her alone in a blinding white void. Her shoulder flared anew, pain jolting her back to the crevice's stone walls. She gasped and clutched at the rock, nails scraping into ice, grounding herself in the only reality left. Outside, the wind rattled the glacier's fissures like distant gunfire. Fear pressed in, but beneath it rose something sharper, defiance. Laurel forced air into her lungs, each inhale a small victory. She began to chant softly, reciting pieces of that bedtime story. Good night, nobody. Good night, noises everywhere. Her voice cracked, yet persisted, echoing in the hollow pocket of ice. Words became anchors, pulling her mind back from the brink. Suddenly, another voice pierced through the storm, a clear, insistent bark of a search dog's handler, vivid as if standing at the crevice mouth. "Here, Jasper!" It faded, leaving a spark of hope amid the roaring tempest. Had the rescue team finally arrived, or had her mind conjured yet another phantom? She could not know, and the uncertainty threatened to undo her. Still, she pressed on. Wrapping her arms around herself, she shifted upright. One slow movement, then another. Despite every shattered lung and frozen fingertip, she staggered toward the crevice's mouth. Outside, the world was a churning storm of snow and ice. Laurel shielded her eyes against the gale, pulling her coat tighter, and planted her feet against the glacier wall. She raised a trembling arm and pounded against the ice, voice thin but unbroken. "Help!" The shout was swallowed instantly, yet it felt triumphant, a declaration that she was still here. As her vision blurred with exhaustion, Laurel Bennett clung to that moment of will. Hallucinations might haunt her, and the mountains might rage against her, but she would endure. For every whispered lullaby, every imagined voice urging her on, she would answer with the pulse of her own heartbeat. Persistent, fierce, alive. On the 8th morning, a brittle silence lay over the mountains, as if the world itself held its breath. Down in the valley, the rescue team gathered near the last known campsite, faces drawn with exhaustion and grim determination. Weathered maps were spread across a folding table, annotated with red ink where searchers had combed ridges and ravines. Every lead had gone cold until Jasper, the veteran scent dog with a mahogany coat and keen nose, arrived at the trailhead. "Let's see what you've got today, boy," his handler murmured, clipping the leash to Jasper's leather harness. The dog's ears pricked forward. Together they climbed the switchbacks toward Laurel's disappearance site, crisscrossing the steep slope where blood and footprints had vanished beneath snowdrifts. Each step upward was a plea against fate. Back on the ridge, Laurel Bennett pressed her cheek against the glacier wall, lips blue and swollen, breath shallow. She could no longer gauge how many hours or days remained. It was as though time itself had fractured on these ice-choked cliffs. With every pulse, she felt herself drifting closer to unconsciousness. Yet somewhere deep inside, a stubborn ember of will flickered, fueled by the memory of her parents' faith and Jasper's imagined bark. Suddenly, above the roar of stinging wind, her ear caught a distant sound, the faint rhythm of paws on rock. Jasper. Hope stabbed through her like sunlight. She forced herself to sit upright, wincing as cold and pain convulsed her body. Her hand left a smeared track of blood on the ice as she pressed it against her coat, searching for purchase. Below, Jasper paused at the edge of the snowfield, nose quivering. He crouched, then bolted forward, weaving through a maze of seracs and crevasses. The handler yelled, "Easy, boy! Show me where!" Jasper picked up speed, weaving toward a steep glacier wall that formed a natural alcove. His tail swept snow in a white arc, then he skidded to a halt, chest pressed low to the ground. The handler rushed forward, heart hammering. 5 searchers in crampons followed. Ice axes and ropes at the ready. Through swirling flurries, they spotted a hollow nearly hidden from view, an indentation in the ice that no map or memory had revealed. Inside lay a figure bundled in a dark coat, limbs drawn tight against the cold. "Ma'am?" the handler called, voice tight with relief. Laurel's eyelids fluttered. She blinked, seeing the concerned faces peering down at her, the sharp blades of crampons inches from her head. She tried to speak, but only a weak croak emerged. "Can you hear me? I'm Mark. You're safe now." He knelt, pulling a bright red survival blanket from his pack and draping it over her shoulders. Warmth bloomed on her spine. Jasper lay his head on her knee, whiskers brushing her frost-numb cheek. Laurel's gaze drifted to the dog's steady eyes. In that moment of rescue, the boundary between despair and deliverance dissolved. She tugged at her frozen fingers, attempting a whisper. "Thank you." The handlers shared a hush of wonder. Against every odd, no training, no proper gear, buried tracks, Laurel Bennett had survived 8 days on a glacier ridge. As they began securing her to a sled for the grueling ascent, Jasper rose and trotted alongside, a silent guardian guiding her back from the edge of oblivion. The wind had eased to a low, keening moan by the time the rescue team closed the final distance to the ice alcove. Frost crusted their eyelashes and crystallized on their jackets as they crouched around the hollowed wall of blue glacier. Jasper pressed his nose to the snow, then looked up, his eyes bright with urgency. The handlers exchanged a glance, then reached forward together, cutting tangled straps of coat and backpack from the curled figure inside. Laurel Bennett lay half-reclined against the ice, her coat pulled up to her chin. Her hair was matted with frost, her cheek pressed against a blood-stained patch of ice that glowed deep crimson in the pale morning light. The handlers worked quickly, unbuckling her soaked boots and peeling back layers of clothing to assess her condition. A smell of copper mingled with melting snow as they noted the ragged gash on her thigh and the grotesque angle of her right shoulder. One medic knelt beside her and murmured, "Laurel, my name's Sarah. You're in the safe zone now." She brushed away a crust of ice from Laurel's cheek. The teenager's lashes fluttered open, revealing eyes clouded with pain and delirium. Laurel's lips parted, and a gravelly whisper drifted through the hollow. "I knew you were trouble when you walked in." The faint melody of a Taylor Swift lyric slipped into the wind, a fragile tether between her fading consciousness and the world she had fought so hard to rejoin. Sarah pressed a gloved hand to Laurel's wrist and found a faint pulse. She glanced at her partner. "She's alive. We've got a pulse, but she's hypothermic and dehydrated." Slowly they replaced the shredded coat with an insulated bivy bag, securing it around her lithe frame, despite bruising and ice swelling the fabric. Jasper nosed Laurel's hand, and she gave a half-smile that trembled through her exhaustion. In that gesture, the handlers saw more than relief. They saw the ember of resilience that had carried her through 8 days of snow and silence. A stretcher was assembled just outside the alcove. Laurel's legs were lashed together with foam padding to stabilize possible fractures. Her arm was immobilized in a makeshift splint. Each movement elicited a muted gasp, but she stared upward, eyes searching, as if still piecing together the path back to that ridge where curiosity had become peril. As they lifted her onto the sled, her voice drifted again, crooking the Taylor Swift refrain. "I'll be the actress starring in your bad dreams." The handlers exchanged a soft laugh under their breath, marveling that even in delirium she clung to a lyric, proof that mind and spirit remain intertwined, even at the brink of collapse. Jasper settled his muzzle against the sled's edge, eyes locked on Laura's face. The handler placed a hand on the dog's head and whispered, "Good work, boy. We're taking her home." Laurel's eyelids fluttered shut just as the team began the painstaking ascent. Each step upward carried more than rescuers and rubble. It carried the weight of a survivor's story, etched forever into ice and memory. The ascent from the glacier alcove felt eternal. Rescuers in crampons heaved the sled uphill, each planted ice axe a lifeline against gravity's pull. Laurel Bennett lay wrapped in her bivy bag, face pale, but eyes flickering, as crevasses yawned like silent sentinels on either side. Snowfall drifted in soft sheets, muffling the grind of ice axes and the sled's runners against the hard-packed snow. Above them, ridge lines sharpened to silver, as if the world itself had become a blade poised between safety and oblivion. Laurel's thigh throbbed with each bump. Her shoulder thudded it against the rigid splint. Yet she met every jostle with steady breaths, eyeing the rescuer's taut expressions. Among them, Mark, the handler who first called her name, and Sarah, the medic whose hands had unwrapped the ice-encrusted coat, moved as one organism. Their careful choreography spared Laurel further injury. A slight tilt here, a whispered count there, and the sled glided over hidden ice lenses without tipping. Halfway up, they paused on a narrow bench, a ledge carved by an ancient sérac collapse. Breathing heavily, the rescuers formed a circle around the sled, shielding Laurel from a sudden gust that rattled the ice walls. Mark knelt beside her, brushing back a frost-bitten strand of hair. Laurel winced but managed a small smile when she recognized him. In the soft hush of snowfall, her voice emerged clear for the first time in days. "Am I in trouble for getting lost?" Silence fell, broken only by the whisper of falling snow. A ripple of relief passed through the team. Sarah's eyes glistened as she replied gently, "No trouble. You did exactly what you could to survive." The words wrapped around Laurel like a warm blanket, tethering her to the moment, even as exhaustion tugged at her eyelids. As they resumed the climb, Laurel drifted between consciousness and memory. She recalled her mother's gentle admonition at breakfast, "Remember to trust yourself," and her father's patient grin as they'd navigated a muddy campsite years ago. Those echoes had carried her this far. Now, each breath felt sacred, each heartbeat a vow renewed. At last, the path leveled, and the rescue party emerged onto a cleared ridge where helicopters circled. Bright lights and rotors blurred into a halo of warmth and promise. Rescuers disembarked to ready a litter for hoist extraction. Laurel's sled was transferred to the new platform. As the helicopter's downdraft rattled her limbs, she closed her eyes, focusing on the distant sound of her father's voice. "You're braver than you know." Up she rose, lifted toward the thumping blades, leaving the glacier's indifferent embrace behind. Below, Jasper stood at the ice's edge, nose pointed to the sky as if bidding farewell. Laurel's final glance at the ridge, a trail washed clean by snow, etched itself into her memory. Then she was airborne, carried by strangers and dreams toward warmth, medical care, and the silent certainty that her story, like the ice itself, was irrevocably changed, but not broken. Laurel Bennett woke to the gentle hum of a hospital ventilator and the faint beeping of monitors marking each heartbeat. Sunlight, diffused by pale curtains, painted soft rectangles across the white-walled room. Her body felt heavy, every limb a muted ache, but beneath the fog of painkillers, she blinked back toward the world she had fought so hard to rejoin. At her side, her mother stirred from a cushioned chair, eyes rimmed with exhaustion and relief. She reached out, brushing a lock of frost-matted hair from Laurel's forehead. "You're safe," she whispered, voice thick with gratitude. Across the room, Laurel's father leaned against the windowsill, hands clasped, gaze fixed on his daughter as if she were the most precious thing he had ever seen. In that moment, the ordinary warmth of home felt like a fortress against the memory of ice and wind. Nurses flitted in and out, adjusting IV lines and changing dressings on Laurel's frost-bitten fingers and bruised thigh. A physical therapist introduced herself with a soft smile and began gently guiding Laurel's leg through tentative bends. Each centimeter of movement made Laurel wince, but she met every small triumph with a determined nod. Pain was the price of survival, she reminded herself, and she would pay it gladly if it meant reclaiming her life. Later, the hospital room door opened again admitting Danny and 2 other girls from the youth group. They stood hesitantly in the threshold, gift bags clutched in their hands. Shadowed by guilt and relief, they spoke in hushed voices about the moment they realized Laurel was missing, the search teams combing the mountain, the echo of Jasper's bark that changed everything. Laurel listened, her throat tight, as they described how the community had rallied. Local guides volunteering their time, church members praying through the night, news crews and strangers sending messages of hope. When they reached her bedside, Danny offered a small sketchbook wrapped in ribbon. Its pages were filled with drawings of pine needles, foxes, and star constellations, scenes Laurel had described before she vanished. Tears filled Laurel's eyes as she traced each line with a trembling finger. "You found your way back," Danny said softly. "Now we all get to remember how you did it." That night, as her parents held vigil, Laurel stared at the ceiling and replayed the journey that had nearly claimed her. The glide of her sketchbook's pages, the crack of ice beneath her boot, the solenness that had felt infinite. In each memory, she uncovered a lesson about resilience, about listening to her inner compass, about the kindness of strangers and the loyalty of a scent dog named Jasper. In her heart, she sketched a promise to honor the fragility of life and the power of hope. The hospital's quiet corridors no longer felt like cages, but corridors to a new beginning, one where every breath would be a testament to survival, every step a portrait of resilience, and every heartbeat a reminder that she had, against all odds, found her way home. When Laurel Bennett stepped onto the forested trail beside Banff's visitor center, the air felt different, warmer, somehow less forbidding. A small group of guides and family members formed a protective lantern of faces around her, each one carrying the memory of her rescue like a torch. Laurel's leg was still stiff, her shoulder wrapped in a supportive brace, but her eyes shone with determination. In her hand, she held a faithful companion, the sketchbook in which she had traced both beauty and terror on that fateful ridge. The guide pointed toward a gentle slope carpeted in alpine flowers. "We'll take it slow," he said, his voice steady. "Whenever you're ready, you can choose where to stop." Laurel nodded, inhaling the scent of pine and fresh earth. Every step was a victory, a reclamation of ground she had once feared would swallow her whole. As they walked, Laurel paused at a cluster of heather. She opened her sketchbook and began to draw, the delicate arch of blossoms, each petal unfurling like hope itself. Her pencil moved deliberately, mapping the soft curves and subtle shadows. Around her, the guides and family members watched in quiet awe, seeing in her concentration the same spark of curiosity that had led her to sketch a fox on the lookout ridge, and nearly cost her everything. Halfway along the trail, they reached a viewpoint overlooking a sapphire-hued lake. Laurel set her pack down and gazed across the water, memory and present merging in the shimmering light. She remembered the crevice where she'd clung to life, the haze of snow that nearly erased her footprints. Yet here she was, alive and sketching in the open air, her lines tracing the contours of recovery as surely as they once traced the fox's muzzle. Her mother knelt beside her, handing Laurel a thermos of warm tea. "You've come so far," she whispered. Laurel offered a small, grateful smile without looking up from her drawing. In that moment, words felt too heavy. The gentle scratch of pencil on paper spoke more truth than any phrase could hold. Danny and her youth group friends arrived next, each carrying a memory or a promise. Together, they unfolded a banner that read, "Welcome home, Laurel." Laurel's breath caught. She stood, stepping into their circle, and allowed herself a moment of laughter, bright, unguarded, triumphant. As evening clouds unfurled in ribbons of sunset over the peaks, Laurel opened her sketchbook's next blank page. Her pencil hovered, tracing an imaginary line between past and future. Beneath the last chapter of her darkest days lay the promise of new stories, the ripple of wind through meadow grasses, the sun's golden flare on mountain ice, the fearless curiosity in a fox's eye. With one last glance at the circling mountains, silent witnesses to her ordeal, Laurel pressed pencil to paper. The first stroke suggested neither terror nor defeat, but a horizon wide open to whatever her heart might sketch next.